All right, good morning and welcome to Cycles in Nature Notes. We're going to be talking about things that go around the world, and we're going to do it in just a few minutes. So before we get started, make sure that you have either some notes that are formatted in your basic four corners kind of layout, or for this set of notes more than any other notes before, I would recommend that you have a notebook and that each cycle is mapped out on a page of this notebook. So keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and dig in. So, cycles in nature. In order to give the organisms something to eat, you kind of need something to replenish the food. The plants need to get water from somewhere. They need to get carbon and nitrogen from somewhere. You need to get your oxygen from somewhere. And therefore, there need to be cycles in nature that get this stuff done. So our goal is going to be to chart out how resources flow and replenish in different cycles. And this really isn't that difficult. In fact, you know the water cycle pretty much from all of your years of education and science learning. The water cycle is, you guessed it, how water moves throughout the biosphere. And it starts with a large pool of water, aka the ocean, and the sun. So let's start out by understanding the water cycle. As the sun's energy hits the wonderful pools of water in oceans and in lakes and other bodies of water, it causes the small molecules of water to break apart from each other and at the surface turn into vapor, which, because it's warmer and higher in energy, rises up through the atmosphere, just like steam would in and out of a pot. So the steam is going to rise from the pot as it turns to a gas because there's more energy applied from the heat underneath the water. So this water is going to evaporate. This is just a play on the word vapor, like steam vapor, evaporation. As it gets higher away from the surface of the earth and into the upper atmosphere, it starts to cool down. And as it cools down, it ends up cooling down into clouds. And we call this cooling down condensation. So these water droplets, as they rise further and further into the atmosphere, are going to condense together into liquid again, and these are what you see as clouds, the beautiful floating ice crystals and water droplets that are so tiny they are suspended in air. Now you keep adding more and more and more and more water due to the evaporation, and you run the risk of these water droplets bouncing into each other. When they bounce into each other, you get condensation to a fuller extent where the clouds start to get fuller. Because less light is able to pass through them, they get darker. They become more of a grayish, darkish hue, and they start to swell up with water. Well, you compress enough of those water droplets together, and you get precipitation. The water droplets get too heavy to stay in the air, and so the water falls from the cloud in either snow, sleet, ice, or rain. This is called precipitation, because what's falling from the clouds is a precipit. That's just a fancy sciencey word for anything that is falling from something else. So the rain starts to fall. Well, gee, what happens to the rain as it starts to fall? Well, it ends up hitting the ground. And that's when one or two things can happen. It can be used up by plants and producers in the area, in which case you have a possibility for transpiration to occur. Transpiration is when water is sucked up into the leaves of producers, and then the sun's energy directly hits those leaves, heats up those leaves, and some of the water evaporates right out of the leaf. And that kind of evaporation is called transpiration. Otherwise, the water will start to collect in pools, lakes, brooks, streams, and rivers in runoff because the water is running off back into the larger bodies of water, whether that's the Great Lakes or the oceans in our case. The nitrogen cycle is a really interesting one because it's very complicated and complex. Why is it complicated and complex? Because everything on Earth uses nitrogen. And for some reason, no one decides to talk to you about the nitrogen cycle until you're in upper junior high and early high school. And I really don't understand why. You need nitrogen to live. Plants need nitrogen to live. Food, the atmosphere, different aspects of ecology need nitrogen. Nitrogen is 70% of the air that you breathe. It's found in the atmosphere as N2 because the nitrogen atoms like buddies, like O2 because the oxygen atoms like to pair up together. Nitrogen flows around our atmosphere as a stable compound. It is the majority gas, and that's when things start to get interesting. So, nitrogen gets absorbed into pretty much our entire ecosystem one of a few different ways. First of all, the most interesting and cool of these methods is lightning. Lightning, when it streaks across the sky, will split these nitrogen atoms apart into just singular nitrogen ions. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons that the air kind of tastes different during a thunderstorm. Also, nitrogen, the gas nitrogen, can be absorbed into droplets of rain as it's falling through the air. And soybeans and other kinds of legumes, certain kinds of plants, have bacteria in their roots that will actually take this nitrogen and will kind of push it into the soil. When it pushes it into the soil, it then uses different kinds of bacteria to turn this nitrogen into ammonia, which is NH3. That means there's one nitrogen and three hydrogens. Turning nitrogen into ammonia is called ammonification. Yeah, it's that simple. Now, why does it need to turn into ammonia? Well, ammonia is like one of nature's magic ingredients. It's one of those useful compounds that is able to be used in a variety of fashions. We use ammonia in cleaning products. You use ammonia in several different processes of your body. But the best use of ammonia is turning it into nitrates. Turning ammonia into nitrates is called nitrification. Just like turning nitrogen into ammonia is called ammonification, turning ammonia into nitrates is called nitrification. You should be sensing a theme. Now, nitrates come in all different shapes and sizes, but they're used in different kinds of plants to fertilize and create good nutrient stores for the things that they produce. That fancy stuff called fertilizer that you put on plants to make them grow more nicely, to grow more efficiently, is just chock full of nitrogen and nitrate compounds. That's all fertilizer is. So trees and other types of plants absorb the nitrates. That's why it's called absorption. Yeah, breaking out the big league vocabulary for this section. And it deposits some of those nitrate compounds in little pockets of storage. Often this will result in fruit. That's right. Some of the fruits in trees are fancy little storage pockets for sugars and nitrates so that the seeds inside that fruit can someday grow up into nice, healthy, strong plants. However, as you can see by the bear munching on one of the plums in this drawing, animals really like fruit because we need some of those nitrogen compounds and, of course, glucose and sugars as well. Only there's a problem. Animals are not immortal, and so therefore they die. And when they die, decomposers are going to start breaking down those organisms, whether plant or animal. And so what you see below the word decomposers are bacteria, worms, fungi, and what they'll end up doing is ripping apart those nitrogen molecules. It's a process called denitrification because we're taking those nitrates that we just nitrified, if you will, and we're ripping them back apart so that you can again get nitrogen in its common form for the atmosphere. Now you may say, Kinnett, look, that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. I'm not sure I get it. Well, good, because the nitrogen cycle is not the easiest thing in nature to understand. I'm not asking you to know all of the ins and outs. I just want you to know the importance of nitrogen, that turning it into whatever it is called ammonification, nitrification, absorption, or denitrification if it's ripping it back apart, and that it flows through the environment. That's really all I'm looking for here. And you can always rewind and watch this over again if you're struggling. The carbon dioxide and oxygen cycle, one of our, again, very basic central core idea cycles that we've known about for a very long time. We breathe out carbon dioxide, oxygen is breathed out by the plants, and we just have this wonderful symbiotic relationship with each other. Well, it's just a bit more complex than that, but it's a lot more simple than you might think. So it starts, of course, with the sun, as most cycles do. The sun is going to help the plants absorb all of the different nutrients that they need. And in the other part of the equation is you. Now, this is a very ugly drawing of the head of a person, basically just the letter C surrounded by the letter C and a dot for the eyeball. And then that weird black arrow that you are seeing is going to be the throat. And we'll explain what all of that gets to here in a moment. This is how you understand the carbon dioxide and oxygen cycle. You breathe out CO2. The plant, taking in sunlight, water, and CO2, will create oxygen, which you then breathe in, and the process repeats. Here's what's actually going on inside of you and inside of the plant. Inside of you, you take 6 of those oxygen molecules paired up into little buddies, just like the nitrogen, and then you take C6H12O6. We remember that. It's glucose. And you turn it inside of every mitochondria into 6 CO2 and 6 H2O. In every one of the cells of your body is taking the oxygen and the glucose and is turning it into water, CO2, and what I didn't list here, ATP. ATP being adenosine triphosphate, that's energy. This process is called cellular respiration. So next to 6 CO2 and 6 H2O, if you want to put plus ATP, I would recommend it. That is cellular respiration. That is the process of how your body breathes in each and every cell. What about the plant side? What's going on over there? Well, plants are going to be taking 6 of the CO2 molecules, 6 water molecules, and adding just a dash of sunlight to create 6 oxygen molecules and a nice, healthy supply of glucose. This is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is pretty simple in nature. It's just the process of plants taking carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, mixing it together in the chloroplast, and creating oxygen, which is kind of a waste product. It's what they, quote unquote, breathe out, and then glucose, which they store and eventually rip apart in their mitochondria to produce the energy that they need. It's the photosynthesis and cellular respiration cycle. It's just an advanced way of understanding how we trade CO2 and oxygen with plants. Now, it's important to understand that what produces most of the oxygen on the earth is actually the algae and plants in the ocean. In fact, the number is somewhere between 70 and 90% at any given time. The trees of the earth, which for a long time you guys were told were the lungs of the earth, is really not true. And while I'm not advocating for it, we could definitely live with a lot fewer trees and be perfectly fine as far as breathing is concerned. Speaking of breathing, this takes us to the carbon cycle, which of course is driven by the sun, as all other things are. Now, when we talk about the carbon cycle, you guys know it as something else. You guys know it as the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is this process where the Earth has kind of a bubble around it atmospherically. We have this nice bubble of air that we breathe. Only here's the catch. The more carbon you add, whether through carbon dioxide, that's CO2, or carbon monoxide, that's CO, the more of those carbon-based molecules you have in the atmosphere, the better the Earth is at holding in heat. Therefore, it kind of works like a greenhouse. A greenhouse is just a fancy building made out of partly tempered glass so that it holds heat in, allowing you to grow plants pretty much year-round inside. The more carbon you have, the warmer the Earth can technically get. And this is all driven by photosynthesis. Of course, that's the process of plants taking in oxygen, taking in water, and taking in sunlight, and then turning that into glucose and oxygen. That glucose is going to become food for animals who, you guessed it, die. And when plants and animals die, that carbon goes into the soil. And a lot of interesting things happen to that carbon that gets ripped into the soil. It gets turned into all different kinds of minerals. And in fact, as we've discovered in the last 10 years, oil in a lot greater quantities than we had originally assumed. For a long time, we believed that oil was something that took millions of years to produce by ancient dead creatures in swamps that were compressed, and it took so many years to create oil. Now we're actually finding out that oil is created in perhaps hundreds and thousands of years rather than millions, which means that a major portion of animals and plants that are dying are ending up being compressed into several different kinds of mineral carbon as well as oil, which we find useful. We actually take that mineral carbon and through various industries, we use it to produce hundreds and thousands of different components for the lives that we use today. And of course, in order to produce that, often it requires heat and engines, which will result in emissions. It actually pumps CO2 as well as CO back into the atmosphere. And this creates kind of an interesting fear cycle because if you produce too many emissions, it can increase the greenhouse effect, which is, of course, where all of the fear of climate change currently comes today. However, it is also important to note that most of the CO2 that's pumped into the atmosphere is, to this day, continually provided by the exhaling and flatulence of mammals and other different organisms. So emissions combined with the natural biological process is going to pump CO2 right back into the atmosphere. Now, if I were actually teaching you in class, this is usually the time where questions would start to pop up, concerned about climate change and how everything is probably falling apart and we're all going to die in a big burning fireball. This isn't actually how that functions. As someone who studied climatology for a good amount of time and keeps pretty up to date on the studies, I'd like to rest assure you that no, we're not all about to die in a big, burning, fiery ball, because the Earth, through these different cycles, actually has several buffers in place. If the temperature of the Earth increases too much, that will melt a significant portion of the ice caps, which will actually do a lot more than just raise the ocean level a couple of inches. In fact, most likely it's going to incorporate too much fresh water into the oceans, which is going to desalinate them. That means kind of remove the average amount of salt. It lowers the average amount of salt. Well, a lot of currents in the ocean drive a lot of the climate patterns on the Earth, storms and rain and weather systems. Now, what does all of this mean? Well, if you remember the EAC from Finding Nemo, where the turtle was like, dude, we got to ride the EAC, all the way around the ocean. That was a major current system, which is driven partly by the level of salt in the ocean. If you increase the level of fresh water in the ocean, it actually destabilizes the current, which stops some of the weather patterns from moving. This is one of Earth's natural buffers to keep from getting too warm. So the destabilization of currents causes a little bit of the destabilization of the weather system, which causes kind of a cold drought to occur, which in turn freezes some of the ice caps. And we see this through some of our record understanding of the Antarctic and polar ice caps. It's happened quite a few times in our history. Now, does this mean that we don't take climate change seriously? Of course not. It's evident that humans are speeding up the cycle of heating up the Earth, and that's definitely not a good thing. You don't want to run a cycle too quickly, or you risk burning it out or something going wrong. The good news is most of the countries around the world, except for China and India, are reducing their emissions, and we're coming up with a lot safer alternatives for energy, which we may discuss in a future assignment. That said, though, these are the 4 cycles that I want you to understand. If you have any questions, you can, of course, reach out to me on Google Classroom. You can reach out to me via email. Make sure that you're checking things. I wish you the best of luck, and I'll see you soon.